History rarely remembers the ones who begin in the shadows. But sometimes, from the filth of the streets and the roar of the crowd, a figure rises who bends the world to her will. Her name was Theodora. To most of Constantinople, she was nothing more than a sideshow, a child of a dead bear trainer, a performer in the Hippodrome, a girl dressed in costumes to make the masses laugh, cry, and forget their hunger for a night. She was entertainment, disposable and replaceable. Yet Theodora refused to remain what they decided she was. She carried scars of hunger, betrayal, and humiliation like armor. She endured being discarded by powerful men, left alone in foreign streets with nothing but the memory of applause. She found herself on church steps, not seeking salvation, but a piece of bread, only to discover a new kind of strength, one forged in faith and fury. And then came the turning point. Theodora crossed paths with Justinian, the man who would become emperor. What began as a single conversation, a debate over the law, ignited one of history's most unlikely alliances. Together, they would change the empire. But make no mistake, Theodora was not merely a consort. When riots threatened to burn Constantinople to the ground, it was her voice that refused to yield, her will that saved the throne. This is not the story of a woman who was given power. It is the story of a woman who seized it, rewrote the rules of Rome, and left a mark so deep it still echoes today. The rustle of silk was the first sound she heard each morning. Not the laughter of siblings or the warmth of her father's voice, but the stiff whisper of fabric carried through the walls, a constant reminder that her life belonged to others. Outside her small chamber, the guards of the Green faction muttered in low tones, their words indistinct yet oppressive, seeping through cracks like a reminder that she and her family were watched, contained, and never truly free. The air was suffocating. Incense, meant to signify wealth and reverence, clung to her skin like a film, mixing with the sweet perfume of orange blossoms drifting up from the palace gardens below. For the adults, these scents were symbols of opulence, of belonging to a faction powerful enough to fill its halls with luxury. But for Theodora, barely 6 years old, it smelled like captivity. Her father, Acasus, had been the anchor of her young life. A trainer of bears and wild beasts, he was a man whose rough hands carried both strength and tenderness. He could calm an enraged animal with a steady look, and to his daughters, he was the embodiment of safety. Then came the fever. It raged through him mercilessly, and within days he was gone. His absence was louder than any noise in the Hippodrome. It was the silence that now filled every corner of their lives. Theodora woke that morning to her mother's muffled sobs, a sound that seemed endless. Her older sisters huddled together in restless sleep, clutching each other for warmth. She lay still, listening to the city beyond their chamber, the distant roar of caged lions, the clatter of buckets, the shouts of handlers preparing for the next spectacle. Life outside continued, indifferent to the collapse of her small world. The room itself was a cruel paradox. Silk hangings, polished mosaics, and glimpses of manicured gardens created the illusion of privilege. But Theodora knew better. These walls did not belong to them. They were lent by the Greens, given only as long as her father's labor was of use. With his death, that debt was called in. The fear in her stomach was not just for hunger, it was for the street. The raw, merciless street of Constantinople, where no child's tears earned pity. 3 days of dread culminated in a scene that seared itself into her memory. Her mother, eyes swollen and hands trembling, dressed the girls in their finest tunics, garments once bright in faction colors, now faded and patched. Each stitch carried the weight of borrowed prosperity. Theodora stood motionless as the tiny buttons at her neck were fastened with cold, hurried fingers. It felt less like being dressed for a visit than for a sacrifice. They were led down the cool marble corridors toward the faction leaders. The usual sounds of the Hippodrome, the chanting crowds, the cries of animals, seemed muted that day, replaced by the echo of their own footsteps. Inside a long, opulent hall, the men of the Greens lounged on cushioned couches, their fingers heavy with gold rings, their bellies full. They did not greet the grieving family with sympathy, but with bored annoyance at the interruption. Her mother spoke. Her voice broke again and again as she pleaded for mercy. She told of her husband's years of service, his loyalty, the beasts he had trained that brought glory to the faction. She asked not for charity, but for survival, another chance, a role, anything to keep her children from starving. Theodora stared at the floor as her mother's dignity crumbled, each word a piece of herself handed over in desperation. The men barely listened. One picked at his nails. Another swirled wine in his cup, his gaze drifting past the children as if they were furniture. When her mother's voice finally faltered into silence, a leader flicked his wrist dismissively. The gesture was effortless, casual, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. They were of no use anymore. Guards shoved them toward the door. The last thing Theodora heard inside that hall was laughter. Cold, mocking laughter that clung to her even as the bright sunlight of the street blinded her eyes. Their fine, threadbare clothing instantly gathered dust, as if the city itself rushed to reclaim them. Her mother's shoulders slumped, her face streaked with tears. For a long moment she seemed broken, paralyzed by despair. Then something shifted. A new, fierce resolve flashed in her eyes. Without a word, she gripped her daughter's hands and marched toward the rival faction's headquarters. The Blues. The journey was a blur of hostile glances and crowded streets. When they arrived, the guards at the Blues gate regarded them not with boredom but with calculation. Inside, the atmosphere was colder, sharper. They were led not to a grand hall but to a small, dim chamber where a single man waited behind a table littered with scrolls. His reputation preceded him, pragmatic, ruthless, adorned with rings that caught the lamplight. His eyes swept over the family, but lingered longest on Theodora. To him, this was not a plea. It was a transaction. After a heavy silence, he gave a slow nod. The family would be taken in, fed, and sheltered. But the price was clear. It was not coin, but loyalty. A lifetime of it. For Theodora, it was the closing of one cage and the locking of another. Her mother gasped in relief, clutching her daughters as if salvation had arrived. But Theodora, staring at the cold rings on the man's fingers, felt only the weight of invisible chains settling on her soul. That night, as the Hippodrome roared in the distance, Theodora lay awake on her pallet. She was no longer just a child who had lost her father. She was a pawn on the board of men who measured lives in terms of usefulness and power. The world she had entered was unforgiving, and she understood, perhaps too early, that survival would demand not innocence, but cunning. The dust of Constantinople clung to her clothes and her memory. The laughter of the Greens still rang in her ears. But somewhere deep within, beneath the grief and fear, a spark flickered. A silent vow, born in the ashes of humiliation, she would not be broken. One day, the world that had crushed her would hear her voice. And when it did, it would not laugh. The streets of Constantinople were merciless. Theodora could still feel the heat of the sun pressing down as her mother pulled her and her sisters through the throngs of people. Market vendors shouted, beggars tugged at sleeves, and the stench of sweat, fish, and horse dung clung to the air. But her mother never slowed. She moved with a singular purpose, her grip on Theodora's hand iron tight, dragging them toward the looming walls of the Blues compound. Where the Greens had mocked, the Blues were different. Their gates were guarded by men in tunics of deep indigo, the color of sea and sky. Their eyes were sharper, less indifferent, more calculating. When the weary family was ushered inside, they entered not a sunlit hall of decadence but a darker, colder chamber. The contrast was immediate, the Blues did not waste wealth on appearances. Their wealth was in power, measured and deliberate. At the center of the chamber sat the leader of the faction, a man whose reputation for pragmatism was well known even in the streets. His table was piled with scrolls, ledgers, and the wax seals of deals struck and debts owed. Theodora felt his eyes pass over her mother, her sisters, then linger on her. His stare was not cruel, but it was not kind either. It was the stare of a merchant weighing the worth of a new commodity. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, stripped of warmth. He would take them in. They would have food, shelter, protection under the Blues banner. But his words carried an unspoken price, their loyalty, their service, their lives bent to the needs of the faction. It was not charity, it was an exchange. Her mother gasped with relief. Tears fell freely as she clasped her daughters to her chest, whispering thanks. For her, this was salvation, a reprieve from the terror of the streets. But Theodora saw something else. She saw chains. They were invisible, but no less real. From that day, their lives were no longer their own. Theodora's new home was the practice yards and performance halls behind the Blues complex. While other children learned letters, she was thrust into the brutal schooling of the Hippodrome. Her instructors were not tutors with scrolls but hardened performers whose voices carried like thunder and whose bodies bore the scars of years under the crowd's judgment. Her classroom was dust and sweat. She learned to twist her body into impossible shapes, to leap and land with a grace that seemed to defy bone and muscle. Her feet toughened, her muscles ached until tears blurred her vision. But she did not stop. Pain was the language of survival. Then came the voice. She was trained not just to move, but to speak so that even the farthest, cheapest seats could hear her. Her words were molded into instruments, sharp, clear, piercing through the roar of thousands. She learned to whisper secrets to the front rows and to hurl proclamations to the sky, to draw laughter with a glance and summon tears with a single tremor in her tone. But perhaps the most important lessons were not in movement or sound, but in mimicry. In the yard, she imitated senators, governors, and priests. The pompous strut of one, the oily smile of another, the solemn beard-stroking of a third. Her fellow performers laughed, but the lessons were deeper. By studying their gestures, she was learning the anatomy of power. Theodora discovered that a smile at the right moment could ensnare a patron, that a pause and a turn back could win a roar of sympathy, that a single well-placed tear tracing through the dust on her cheek could earn more than a night's wage. Emotion itself was currency, and she was learning to spend it with precision. By her early teens, Theodora was no longer just another performer. She was the star. Crowds cheered her name until the stones of the Hippodrome seemed to tremble with it. She could feel the intoxicating rush of adoration each night, the warmth of thousands of eyes fixed on her alone. But adoration was fickle. One day she was celebrated, the next she risked rotten fruit if her fire dimmed. The crowd was a beast, roaring one moment, jeering the next, and she became its creature. It gave her bread and fleeting glory. It could just as quickly devour her. Behind the curtain, the reality was uglier. Wealthy men in the best seats did not see her as an artist, but as property to be sampled and discarded. Coins were tossed not as tribute but as payment for fantasies. Hands brushed too close, voices whispered ownership into her ear. Each night ended not in triumph, but in the quiet humiliation of retreating into shadows where her value was tallied, her humanity ignored. The Blues had kept their promise. She and her family were fed, sheltered, protected. But the price was clear. Theodora had sold not just her labor, but her future. She belonged to the faction, to the arena, to the whims of men who saw her not as a child growing into a woman, but as an object to be consumed. Yet even in this cage, Theodora sharpened her resolve. Every performance was practice in control, every humiliation a reminder of what she would one day overcome. She began to understand that power did not only rest in rings of gold or seats in the Senate. Power could be crafted in perception, in the way she held her head, in the way she used silence as deftly as speech. Each night, as the cheers faded and she returned to her pallet, she replayed every gesture, every laugh, every tear she had drawn from the mob. She was learning more than survival, she was learning mastery. The Blues thought they had bought a pawn. What they had unknowingly nurtured was a player who would one day turn the board itself upside down. By the age of 16, Theodora had become more than an entertainer. She was a force that drew light and sound toward her. Her beauty sharpened into something formidable, cheekbones dusted with gold, eyes that could flash with laughter or cut with disdain, a voice that could turn a crowd into a single living creature hanging on her words. But beneath the applause, the hollowness remained. The silks she wore were costumes, not garments of her choosing. The cheers were not for her, but for the fantasy others had purchased. She knew, deep down, that she was still trapped. It was in this fragile balance, beloved by the masses, owned by the faction, that Theodora's next turning point appeared. Not in the form of a jeering patron or a sneering rival, but in the figure of a man who watched her not with lust or boredom, but with an unsettling, quiet intensity. His name was Hiluz. A governor from the North African provinces. A man of rank, responsibility, and ambition. And for Theodora, his attention would mean the possibility of escape, an escape that would change everything. By the time Theodora turned 16, she was no longer just a performer, she was the heartbeat of the Hippodrome stage. The crowd adored her, at least in the fleeting way crowds adore anyone. Her voice cut through the roar of thousands, her movements seemed to bend light itself, and her beauty, no longer that of a child but sharpened into something commanding, was whispered about in taverns and shouted in the streets. She was the star. But the applause was hollow. Every bouquet thrown at her feet carried the weight of expectation. Every cheer was laced with possession. To the wealthy men seated in the front rows, she was not an artist but a fantasy they had paid to witness. Coins tossed on stage clinked not as tribute but as reminders, "You are ours." And when the curtain fell, she retreated into the shadows, stripped of humanity, reduced to value tallied in ledgers. Theodora learned to play the part, but inside she felt the emptiness gnaw at her. She had power over the crowd, yes, but no power over her own fate. The silks on her back were costumes, not freedom. The roar of the mob was not respect, but consumption. She was a commodity, celebrated, exploited, and always replaceable. It was during one of these long nights, when the clamor of the arena faded into the stillness of the compound, that she first noticed him. Hiluz. He did not watch her the way others did. His gaze carried none of the leering hunger she had come to expect, nor the bored detachment of men too rich to care. Instead, he studied her with quiet intensity. Hiluz was a provincial governor from Pentapolis, in North Africa. His bearing was different, less indulgent, more severe, the weight of responsibility etched into the way he carried himself. Unlike others, he did not push through the mob of admirers after a performance. He waited. He chose a moment of privacy, calculated and deliberate, to speak with her. And what he offered was not a purse of coins for a night's diversion. He offered a future. He asked her to leave Constantinople, to accompany him as his acknowledged companion. It was not love, Theodora was far too shrewd to be fooled by such illusions, but it was legitimacy. A chance to escape the dust of the arena, the sneers of senators, the endless humiliation. For Theodora, the choice was clear. It was a door swinging open on a new world. And she stepped through it without hesitation. The sea voyage south was both terrifying and exhilarating. She stood at the ship's rail, the salt wind in her hair, watching Constantinople recede into the haze. Ahead lay Africa, a place she could scarcely imagine, and with it, the chance to shed the skin of an actress. For weeks, she savored the novelty of her position, treated with deference as the companion of a governor, walking through sun-baked courtyards, dining in open-air chambers beneath unfamiliar stars. For a brief season, she allowed herself to believe the cage had been broken. But cages take many forms. The message from Constantinople arrived suddenly, as cold and final as a blade. Hiluz had been recalled. His term was over. Preparations for his return were swift and efficient, and excluded her. The silks and jewels he had given her were packed away, not in her chests but in his. The servants who had bowed their heads now averted their eyes. And at the harbor in Alexandria, he left her. No farewell, no coin pressed into her palm, not even the courtesy of a lie. He simply boarded his ship, his figure swallowed by the machinery of ambition, and sailed away. Theodora stood alone on the docks, the heat of the Egyptian sun bearing down on her like judgment. 1,000 miles separated her from the only home she had ever known. Around her swirled a cacophony of foreign tongues, and within her chest, the hollow echo of betrayal. For the first time, she truly had nothing. The days that followed were brutal. She drifted through Alexandria like a shadow, her proud posture bent under the weight of hunger. The applause of the Hippodrome was replaced by the growl of an empty stomach. The trades she had once mastered, smiles, dances, tears, were now humiliating tools of survival. She learned which markets left stale bread at closing, which alleys offered shelter, which streets to avoid when the sun went down. But it was not just hunger that pursued her. It was despair, the creeping realization that she had gambled on escape and lost. She had been discarded like a prop after a performance, her value spent, her dignity shattered. It was in this state, gaunt and weary, that her wandering feet led her to a small chapel tucked away from the city's grand avenues. She entered not out of piety, but desperation, the cool shade and the promise of food drew her inside. The Monophysites, a persecuted sect, offered simple bread and wine to the wretched. She accepted with trembling hands, her head bowed in shame. And then something unexpected happened. The words of the patriarch filled the dim chamber, sonorous and passionate. They did not speak of a distant, judgmental God, but of Christ who had suffered, who had been cast out, who understood abandonment and agony. For Theodora, it was a revelation. Here was not a faith of power and privilege, but of the marginalized. A faith that turned suffering into strength. It was not a gentle awakening but a fierce, calculated realignment of her soul. In those words, she found not comfort, but a framework for her rage. Theodora became more than a penitent. She offered herself to the church as a scribe, a messenger, a pair of eyes and ears. Her mind, once honed for mimicry and performance, now absorbed theology and politics. She studied how patriarchs swayed emperors, how doctrine shaped law, how church and state coiled together in the same serpent of influence. The hunger in her belly was slowly replaced by a different hunger, a thirst for power that could not be taken away at a dockside. She began to understand that influence was not only in coins or applause, but in words, in alliances, in the careful weaving of information. In the crucible of Alexandria, Theodora was remade. The abandoned mistress became a strategist. The performer became a student of power. The girl who had once danced for coins now plotted for a future of her own design. When she finally secured passage back to Constantinople, she was no longer the same woman who had left. The salt spray on her face as the ship cut through the wine-dark sea felt like a baptism. She was returning not as a discarded actress, not as a governor's companion, but as something new, a woman who had faced hunger, betrayal, and humiliation, and had forged from them a weapon sharper than any sword, her will. Ahead, the domes of the great city glimmered in the distance. Theodora's eyes did not waver. She had been a child in a cage, a star in a prison, a lover discarded. Now she would return as a predator, patient, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Theodora had been abandoned before, but never like this. On the sun-bleached docks of Alexandria, the taste of betrayal was sharper than the salt in the air. The ship that carried Hilus grew smaller with each passing wave, until it became a speck swallowed by the horizon. For hours she stood motionless, her feet burning on the wooden planks, her eyes unblinking. When the ship finally vanished, she remained alone. Alexandria was a city of noise and color, a crossroads of the empire, alive with merchants, sailors, and scholars. But to Theodora, it was an alien labyrinth. The language in the markets was strange to her ears, the sense of spices and fish overwhelming, the crowds indifferent to the lost young woman who wandered among them. Once, she had commanded the gaze of thousands, now, she could barely catch a baker's eye for a scrap of stale bread. Hunger became her constant companion. Her once proud posture bent under its weight. She learned to read the streets like she once read the moods of the Hippodrome crowd. Which alleys offered shade? Which stalls might leave fruit unattended? Which bakeries would toss crusts at closing? Survival was no longer about applause, it was about invisibility. Nights were worse. Theodora drifted through the city like a ghost, curling into corners where the stench of fish masked her presence. She pressed her hands against her empty stomach and remembered the roaring crowds, the lights, the silks. The contrast was unbearable. Every humiliation she had endured in Constantinople seemed almost merciful compared to this gnawing void. It was during one of these desperate wanderings that she stumbled upon a small chapel. It was tucked away from Alexandria's grand colonnades, hidden in a warren of streets that smelled of dust and sweat. The building itself was plain, unadorned, its doorway dark and uninviting. Yet from within came the faint scent of bread and the murmur of voices. Theodora entered not out of faith but out of need. Inside, the air was cool, dim, and heavy with incense. A handful of worshippers knelt in silence, their garments threadbare, their faces lined with hardship. This was no grand basilica of power and pomp. This was a refuge for the persecuted, the Monophysites, Christians whose belief in the single divine nature of Christ set them at odds with the official church. A woman placed a piece of coarse bread into Theodora's trembling hands, along with a cup of thin wine. She ate in silence, shame burning hotter than her hunger. But as she lingered, the voice of the patriarch rose from the shadows. His words filled the chamber, sonorous and raw. He spoke of a Christ who suffered, who was cast out, who bled for the despised. He spoke of rejection not as defeat, but as kinship with the divine. For the first time in months, Theodora listened not as an entertainer, not as a survivor, but as a soul pierced by recognition. Here was a story she understood. Her conversion did not come as a gentle revelation but as a fierce realignment. The stagecraft of her old life, the mimicry, the timing, the performance, was reborn in this new identity. She became not an actress, but a penitent. Not a performer, but a fervent convert. She offered her services to the church. At first, she was a messenger, a scribe, a quiet observer in the corners of strategy meetings. But her intellect, long sharpened for the games of the Hippodrome, now devoured theology and politics. She studied how patriarchs shaped doctrine to sway emperors, how bishops maneuvered in shadows, how faith itself could be wielded as a weapon sharper than any sword. In those dim back rooms, where whispered names and grievances were exchanged like currency, Theodora listened. And she remembered. The hunger in her belly was slowly replaced by another kind of hunger. Not for bread, but for permanence. For influence that could not be stripped away on a whim, could not be abandoned on a dock. She began to weave her own web of understanding, mapping out the coils of power between church and empire. Months turned into years. Theodora no longer looked like the star of Constantinople. Her silks were replaced by coarse wool, her painted face by the pallor of fasting. To passers-by, she was a reformed sinner, bowed in humility, living proof of the Church's saving grace. But behind her penitent eyes, a sharper fire burned. Theodora had discovered something that neither the greens, the blues, nor Hilus had given her, agency. It was not the applause of a mob or the indulgence of a patron. It was the slow, deliberate power of knowledge. She had learned that words could bend laws, that belief could bind empires, that faith could topple kings. Theodora was no longer content to be a pawn in anyone's game. She was learning to play her own. Eventually, her work with the church afforded her enough coin to secure passage back to Constantinople. The decision was not made lightly. To return was to face the city that had mocked her, discarded her, laughed at her mother's pleas. But Theodora was no longer the same girl who had left. The ship that carried her north was a humble merchant cog, its timbers heavy with grain and oil. She stood at the rail, her hair whipped by the sea wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. The salt spray stung her face like baptism, washing away the last remnants of the actress, the mistress, the abandoned girl. Ahead lay the city of domes and mosaics, the beating heart of the empire. She was not returning as a performer begging for applause, nor as a cast-off clinging to a man's shadow. She was returning as something forged in hunger, betrayal, and faith. A strategist. A predator. A woman who had faced ruin and had not only survived, but sharpened her will to steal. When the familiar silhouette of Constantinople rose from the horizon, her heart did not tremble. She did not think of the jeers of the Greens, or the calculating stares of the Blues, or the ship that had left her to rot in Alexandria. She thought only of the palace domes gleaming in the sun, and of the invisible threads of power that wound their way through its halls. Threads she was ready to weave into her own design. Theodora had been many things, a child in a cage, a dancer in the dust, a mistress discarded. Now she would return as a woman remade, cloaked in humility, but watching, waiting, calculating. For the first time in her life, she was not seeking escape. She was seeking conquest. The ship that carried Theodora back to Constantinople was no governor's vessel, no gilded barge of power. It was a simple cog, its deck creaking beneath sacks of grain and jars of oil. But to Theodora, its timbers carried something greater than cargo. They carried her resolve. She stood at the railing as the domes of the city emerged from the mist, her eyes cold and steady. She was not returning as a discarded mistress. She was returning as a strategist. The Golden Horn bustled with noise as the ship docked, shouts of stevedores, the creak of ropes, the bray of donkeys pulling carts heavy with goods. Theodora stepped onto the worn planks of the harbor with only a small bundle of possessions, but inside she carried something far heavier, an unshakable will. She would not crawl back to the Blues. She would not beg for scraps in the Hippodrome. She would build a life of her own design, strand by deliberate strand. Her first act was to secure a home, small and unadorned. A single whitewashed room tucked in a warren of narrow streets that climbed toward the palace hill. Its only luxury was a sliver of a view. Between taller buildings, she could see the domes of the imperial complex and the standard snapping in the wind. It was enough. Inside that room, she placed a spindle and a daff. Each morning, as the city awoke, she seated herself by the window and worked wool into thread. Her hands, once trained for dance and gesture, now turned to the repetitive rhythm of labor. To her neighbors, she was a picture of penitence, the fallen actress remade into a humble spinner. Respectable. Harmless. But her humility was a costume, as carefully chosen as any role she had ever played. Behind the lowered gaze and bowed shoulders, her eyes missed nothing. She noted the comings and goings of palace officials, memorized the patrols of guards, observed which senators favored which routes through the streets. The whirring of her spindle was not just work, it was the sound of patience. Each thread she spun was a strand of the web she was weaving, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in the rhythm of footsteps. One morning, as the sun slanted across the cobbles outside her door, Theodora heard them, the measured tread of soldiers, the murmur of advisers, the hush of a city bowing in respect. Justinian, nephew to the Emperor Justin, was passing through. His reputation already preceded him, severe, brilliant, consumed by the intricacies of law and administration. A man as cold and sharp as the statutes he wielded. Theodora did not rush to the window. She remained seated, her hands still on the spindle, her back straightening slightly. When his shadow crossed her threshold, she lifted her gaze. It was not the demure glance of a penitent, nor the bold flirtation of an actress. It was something else entirely, a direct, unflinching assessment. Her eyes met his, unwavering, and in that instant the careful distance between prince and spinner dissolved. Justinian was accustomed to eyes that dropped in fear, or narrowed in calculation. He was not accustomed to being seen, truly seen, by a woman who showed no trace of intimidation. He paused. His retinue faltered, silence stretching in the air. Then Theodora spoke. Her voice was low but carried clearly, trained long ago to cut through the roar of the Hippodrome. She did not flatter him. She did not beg. Instead, she challenged. She referenced a recent edict, a matter of property rights debated in the Senate, and she offered a counterargument. It was not the voice of a scholar quoting dusty scrolls. It was the voice of someone who understood how laws landed on the lives of real people. She spoke of loopholes that would benefit only the powerful, of consequences the lawmakers had ignored, of a more equitable interpretation. Justinian froze, listening. Then, slowly, the mask of severity on his face shifted into something else, fascination. That conversation was the spark. Justinian returned again, and again. Sometimes with advisors, sometimes alone. Each time, Theodora met him not as a supplicant but as an equal. Their debates grew sharper, their exchanges more daring. He was a man who lived and breathed law, and here was a woman who not only matched his intellect but challenged it, sharpening his own thoughts in the process. It was intoxicating. For a man who had conquered scrolls and statutes, Theodora was an enigma he could not master, and that only drew him closer. But there was a wall between them. An ancient law, carved deep into Roman custom, forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses or prostitutes. To the patricians of Constantinople, it was a safeguard of purity, a way to keep women like Theodora forever beneath them. For Justinian, it was an absurdity. For Theodora, it was a familiar chain, one she refused to wear. What followed was nothing short of audacious. Justinian did not beg or scheme. He did what he did best, he dismantled the law itself. He set scribes and lawyers to work, unfurling scrolls of Greek and Latin statutes across marble tables. He scrutinized the codes, not for wisdom but for weakness. With surgical precision, he isolated the old law as an archaic contradiction, a fossil of morality that no longer fit the empire's needs. He reframed the matter not as personal desire but as reform, as modernization, as an act of imperial clemency. His arguments were relentless, his will unyielding. And finally, in the private chambers heavy with incense, Justinian bent the ear of his aging uncle, the Emperor Justin. He spoke of stability, of symbolism, of the strength that would come from uniting with a woman of the people. He spoke of Theodora's piety, her reformed character, her sharp mind, all carefully documented and presented. The old emperor, weary and trusting his nephew's judgment, relented. He signed the decree. It was 525 AD, and the law was obliterated. A new statute was proclaimed across the empire, one that would forever bear Theodora's name. The proclamation was more than permission to marry. It was a declaration of power. Theodora's path to the throne, once barred by centuries of prejudice, was now paved with the ink of a new law. For the first time, she tasted the true force of imperial authority, not borrowed, not begged, but bent and reshaped for her alone. She understood what it meant. This was no mere act of love. This was the raw material of obsession, and she would wield it with the skill of a master. The performer who had once survived by drawing tears from crowds had now drawn the empire itself into her orbit. And Constantinople, watching from the shadows, understood too. The bearkeeper's daughter, the actress, the discarded mistress, she was about to become something no one had imagined. An empress in waiting. The year was 525 AD, and Constantinople had never seen anything like it. In the Church of the Holy Apostles, incense swirled thickly in the air, mingling with the drone of chants and the glint of jeweled mosaics. Senators stood in rigid rows, their faces masks of solemnity, but their eyes betrayed them. Behind the forced composure lay raw contempt. At the center of it all stood Theodora. The crown, heavy with pearls and gold, descended onto her head, the patriarch's hands trembling slightly as he settled it into place. The weight was immense, pressing against her temples, but it was nothing compared to the invisible weight of scorn bearing down on her. She could feel it like needles on her skin, the disbelief, the outrage, the whispered insults. The bearkeeper's daughter. The actress. The woman who mocked us all by standing here. Yet Theodora did not flinch. Years on the stage had taught her stillness, had trained her to wear expressions like armor. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and became marble. If they wanted to see weakness, they would find none. She was Augusta now, Empress of Rome, and no man in that hall could strip her of it. Beside her, Justinian radiated imperial certainty. His love for her was clear, but more than that, his faith in her was absolute. They were no longer two figures drawn together by fascination and law. They were rulers, and the city would bow, or burn. That test came swiftly. In January of 532, Constantinople erupted. What began as outrage over a botched execution ignited into something larger, the Nika riots. The ancient rivalry between the Greens and the Blues, factions that had defined Theodora's childhood, dissolved in the heat of fury. For once, the enemies found common cause, hatred for the emperor and his empress. The Hippodrome, once the stage of Theodora's performances, became the beating heart of rebellion. The chants were no longer for games or victories. They were for blood. They screamed one word, again and again, until the palace walls shook with it. Nika. Conquer. But the conquest they demanded was not for races. It was for Justinian's throne, and Theodora's head. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. The heavy bronze doors trembled under the force of stones and makeshift battering rams. The mosaics of the great halls quivered as if the empire itself was cracking. Justinian's advisors, usually calm and calculating, had turned into a chorus of panic. They begged him to flee. The royal barges were waiting at the sea gate. To stay was suicide. The emperor wavered. His shoulders, once straight with resolve, now sagged under the weight of doom. He looked toward the hidden passage that led to the harbor, his face gray with defeat. In that moment, Theodora saw not only the collapse of her husband but the collapse of everything they had built together. And she refused. She rose, not with haste, but with a quiet, deliberate grace. Every humiliation of her youth, every jeer, every betrayal, every night of hunger and despair coiled within her, fueling the words that cut the silence like a blade. "My lords," she began, her voice clear and steady, "flight is not the way." The room stilled. Guards, advisors, even Justinian turned to her. "For one who has been an empress," she continued, "to live as an exile is unbearable." The purple, her eyes swept the chamber, fixing each man in place, "is a fine burial shroud." The words landed like hammer blows. She was offering no false hope, no promise of safety. She was offering something far more potent, defiance. To die in the imperial purple was to claim eternity, to carve their names into history as rulers who refused to kneel. To flee was to live as ghosts, mocked in foreign courts, stripped of dignity. Her eyes locked with Justinian's. She was not pleading. She was commanding. She would rather die an empress than live as a refugee. And in that moment, something shifted. The fear that had paralyzed the chamber drained away, replaced by steel. Her courage was contagious, spreading like fire. The emperor straightened. The indecision vanished from his face. Orders barked forth, not of retreat, but of attack. Generals Belisarius and Mundus, men of ruthless brilliance, had been waiting. With elite troops at their command, they executed a trap. While the mob was drunk on its own fury inside the Hippodrome, soldiers sealed the exits. The rioters, tens of thousands strong, found themselves caged within the very arena that had defined Theodora's life. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. The disciplined blades of imperial troops fell upon the unarmed mass with brutal precision. The air filled with screams, the sand with blood. By dawn, the rebellion was over. 30,000 corpses carpeted the Hippodrome floor. The city was silent. Not with peace, but with terror. The throne, trembling only hours before, was now unshakable. From that day, Theodora was no longer seen merely as Justinian's consort. She was his co-ruler, his equal in will and authority. It was her defiance that had saved the empire, her voice that had drowned out fear. Senators who once sneered at her name now spoke it with caution. The crowd that once jeered now remembered her as the woman who had faced down the mob itself. Her reign had begun in fire and blood. But it would not end there. For Theodora, power was not only about survival. It was about change. And she intended to leave her mark, not only on the laws of men but on the very stones of Constantinople. The girl who had once been laughed at in the halls of the Greens had become the empress who silenced a city with a single speech. And she would never look back. The smoke of the Nika riots had long since faded, but their shadow lingered. The Hippodrome, once her stage as a child, had been turned into a graveyard for 30,000 souls. The city learned quickly, Theodora was not merely an empress by title, she was a sovereign by will. From that day forward, she stood not beside Justinian as an ornament, but beside him as a partner. Equal. Essential. For 2 decades, her influence seeped into every corner of the empire. While Justinian crafted his great codices of law, Theodora wrote her own edicts, each one marked by the memory of her own suffering. She had known hunger. She had known humiliation. She had known the cold indifference of men who saw women as property. And she would not let the empire continue in that blindness. Her reforms were bold. She struck at the system of forced prostitution, declaring that women would not be dragged into brothels against their will. Safe houses and sanctuaries sprang up throughout the city, offering refuge to those who had once been trapped in the same cycle she herself had narrowly escaped. She gave mothers new rights over their children, rights her own mother had been denied when begging before the Greens. These laws were more than ink on parchment. They were ghosts laid to rest, wounds turned into shields for others. For every insult hurled at her, actress, harlot, usurper, there was a woman whose life was made freer because Theodora had lived. Her vision did not stop with parchment. She looked to stone. When the riots had reduced the old church of Hagia Sophia to ash, Theodora insisted it be rebuilt, not as it was, but greater. Architects and mathematicians were summoned, commanded to dream beyond limits. And dream they did. Under her relentless oversight, a dome rose that seemed to float between earth and heaven, vast and golden, a canopy of light that transformed the skyline of Constantinople forever. The Hagia Sophia was not just a church. It was a statement. A monument to survival, to resilience, to a city and an empress who could be broken but would always rise again. Each morning, when sunlight struck its mosaics and bathed the city in a golden glow, Constantinople saw not only the glory of God but the imprint of Theodora. But even the strongest wills cannot silence the body forever. In her early 40s, Theodora began to weaken. Physicians whispered of an enemy they scarcely understood, a crab-like growth that spread inside her, eating away at strength she had once wielded like a blade. The pain was constant. Some days, it bent her double. Others, it left her sleepless, pacing the perfumed silence of her chambers. Yet she did not falter in public. She continued to attend councils, to meet envoys, to press her will into law. If her body betrayed her, her spirit did not. She had faced mobs screaming for her death. She had faced hunger that gnawed at her bones. She had faced betrayal on foreign docks. She would face this, too, with defiance. In 548 AD, the end came quietly. She lay in her imperial chambers, surrounded by silks and incense, the sounds of the city murmuring beyond palace walls. Justinian was at her side, his severe face carved with grief. He had remade an empire through law and conquest, but he knew his greatest strength had always been her. Theodora, the bear-keeper's daughter, the dancer in the Hippodrome, the discarded mistress, the Empress of Rome, breathed her last. She was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, clad in the purple she had once declared the noblest of shrouds. The same purple that had saved an empire in its darkest hour. Her death did not silence her. Her presence lingered, in the sanctuaries she had built, in the rites she had carved into law, in the golden dome of Hagia Sophia that still seemed to touch the heavens. For women across the empire, she was proof that chains could be broken, that scorn could be turned into sovereignty. Theodora's enemies saw her as a scandal, a stain on Rome's dignity. But history remembers her differently. She was a survivor who bent humiliation into power, who seized the tools of her oppressors and forged them into weapons of her own. Perhaps that was the true terror she inspired in the men who despised her, not that she had once been powerless, but that she had discovered just how much power a woman could wield when she refused to bow. The barefooted child who once lay awake listening to her mother weep in the halls of the Greens had become the empress who reshaped an empire. Her crown was not merely gold and pearls, it was every wound, every slight, every betrayal she had endured and transformed. And so her legacy remains, not only in stone or parchment, but in the warning it carries to all who would seek to keep others in chains. That one day, those very chains might be reforged into a crown.